But when you have a Boston police officer who just set the fourth fire of a night, and he's laying in the woods in a town outside of Boston, and the state police have swarming the area now, and they pull over and start shining their light in the woods, and the police officer is laying some 20 or 30 feet into the woods and pulls his gun out again and gets ready if the cops come in.
I think that was, in the book, that was the most chilling moment. I mean, because I just, when you wrote that, and you put that account in there, and to me it was like, again, I said, like, one of the strong points of the book was that, you're almost rooting for the bad guys in the beginning, especially with if you're a firefighter out there and you have knowledge of fire behavior, you're like, this is going to be a good job.
You ready, Seb? Off we go, my man.
Hey, everybody, it's Rob, National Fire Radio. We're here tonight with a special guest in the studio, Wayne Miller, retired ATF agent and author of Burn, Boston, Burn. In the studio joining us is the one and only Jeremy Donch.
Hello.
And our senior man, Tucker Daly.
Hey.
Senior man. Senior citizen or senior man?
Senior man. Well, I wasn't going to go to the senior citizen.
All right, we'll leave it. I'm sorry. I still love you.
Yeah.
All right, listen. We got important business in here tonight, Rob. Let's do this. Wayne, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for being here. I can't wait to dive into your story. Rob was the one that tracked you down, chased you down, and said, "Listen, we got a story to tell." So, Rob, take it away, man. Let's jump right into this, brother.
All right, so I came across, I think it was on social media or something, his book, and I was like, "Burn, Boston, Burn. This looks pretty cool." Open it up, and I just start reading the first couple pages, and completely enthralled with the story of 264 fires. And I reached out to one of the Boston guys that we know through the show, and I said to him, I was like, "Do you know anybody who worked in this time frame?" And he said, "Oh yeah, it was crazy. The guys were going them, multiples in a night." And I was just like, yeah, how does that? And then you read about it in the book, and halfway through, I said, we got to capture this guy's story. And we wrote an email, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, one day, Wayne calls me, and I'm like, "Hello," and he's like, "Hey, it's Wayne Miller. What's up?" And I'm like, "This is the guy." So yeah.
I'm very easy to get a hold of.
Yeah. So Burn, Boston, Burn. Like the book centers around this arson ring that happened in the early 80s, so 1982 to 83?
84.
Or 84, okay. And like I said, this book is centered around it. But before we dive into that, you didn't, I assumed from reading the book, even after I knew that you were an ATF agent, that you had a background in the fire department, but that's not actually...
Not at all.
Yeah, so go into your background a little bit for the folks that are out there, and just really quick as we dive into this.
I never once thought in my life I'd be an arson investigator.
Yeah.
I ended up starting out in engineering in college, and didn't like it whatsoever. So I went to Bryant College, which is now Bryant University. Back then they had criminal justice. Something ironic. I was on the front page of the Boston Globe business section, and I didn't take business at Bryant, and they did away with the criminal justice program because they wanted to be just solely a business school. But it was a Greyhound bus terminal fire during a strike.
No kidding.
And I had my ATF jacket on, and I was right there on the front page of the business section. So
that's pretty funny.
So at Bryant College, I loved criminal justice from day one. And my senior year, they had a career day, and different agencies came up to talk in the auditorium, and somebody from ATF was there. And I really didn't know anything about ATF, and I don't think many people did. So when I listened, I decided to take the exam as soon as I could.
Yeah.
And the exam was good for Secret Service, Customs, IRS, and ATF.
Give me a time frame on this. What year?
That was 1975.
Okay.
Yep. I graduated Bryant in 75.
Okay.
And was there a family history of law enforcement or
None.
civil service or anything like that? Or
None
just
whatsoever.
Okay.
Not at all. I ended up not getting a job coming out of college, and I finished number one in that class, and I didn't have a job.
Wow.
Yeah. I ended up going down to Dennis PD down on the Cape, and I worked undercover down there for them, buying drugs for the summer. And then I ended up working for Killington as night security for the winter. And ATF called because of my exam. My score was really good, competing against veterans, et cetera.
Yeah.
I did well, and Boston office doubled in 1976 from 40 agents to 80 agents. And,
Wow.
Is that because of the load picking up, or?
Well, we had a concentrated urban enforcement was a new program trying to stop guns and crime, that type of thing. So that's why they doubled the office. But over the next 25 years, they only hired another 40. So it's just the luck of being born in a certain time period.
Right.
Yeah.
And I did my whole career in Boston. I came on June 21, 1976. And my first few years, I was buying guns on the streets. I had a few good gun cases. The night Elvis died, I know exactly what bar I was in Hyde Park trying to buy guns.
Kidding.
You know, it's one of those things that stick in your head. You know?
Yeah.
But when they got serious about the arson business, I knew I wanted to do something besides just doing undercover work. And I realized that working fires was very different. As an arson investigator or a fire investigator, you interview a business owner, a cab driver, a homeless person, a banker, insurance people, all on the same case. And that's what a lot of law enforcement is about, is interviewing.
Right.
And coming up with information, where to go with cases, and working arson cases with all the different motives behind arson. ATF's concentration was supposed to be arson for profit, because the local departments really didn't have the time, energy, expertise, or money to work on a lot of complicated cases.
Right. They'd have investigative units that go out, find cause and origin, but nothing on a grandiose scale, if you will. Right?
Exactly. Plus across jurisdictions of, if arsonists out of town.
And you're talking about a lot of money involved in an arson for profit case. Like, it's not like, and I think that's always something that jogs into people's minds about, like, when it becomes a felony charge, as far as the actual cost, but it's not just a couple $1,000s. You're looking at anywhere from 30 to 60 to upwards of, millions.
Absolutely.
So how did the ATF in this time period shift into fire investigation and arson as this, like, what was there a catalyst that kind of kicked this off, that the agency was like, hey, we need to start putting our hands in this because, no one's really doing it and it's got to be done?
That's a good question. Do you remember there was a whole magazine that came out, a whole study that federal government did, America Burning or something like that. Yep. It was called. And the major cities, you guys know New York better. New York, certain areas were burning down nightly.
The Warriors.
Yeah, exactly. The Warriors. Mike Foley's The
Bronx
Warriors.
Is burning. That's right.
The Warriors. Mike Foley from Boston wrote The Warriors.
Right.
So was it all that like the late 70s for everybody, or?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. And not just New York and Boston.
Right.
But other major cities. It was a lot of, because urban renewal really, cities got blighted by then for some reason. And
it was just decay, right?
I
was even thinking where you were going to when you were talking about your early career of buying guns and so on. I mean, just the inner cities were really crumbling, right? I mean, it was crime, a lot of crime.
Yeah, there was. And
unemployment? I mean, was it?
When was it that New York City went bankrupt and they were asking the federal government for help, and they were like,
that was under Koch.
So I don't know.
Okay.
70s.
Yeah.
So what happened was ATF had the explosive laws. Mm-hmm. And so anything that had an explosion in the 70s, ATF had jurisdiction. And they expanded that, started in the late 70s. There was a couple people who were higher ups who had an interest in getting into the fire business. If you poured some gasoline in this room at the right amount, the right mixture, it could explode. So that came under the explosive law.
Gotcha.
Okay. And so the fire, that's how we back-ended into the fires initially. And then Ronald Reagan in 1980, or 82, I think he signed it. He changed the federal law. If you damage or destroy a building by explosive or fire, the 2 words got added, or fire, and ATF had jurisdiction.
Gotcha.
Because, again, the local guys couldn't expend the energy, time, money to investigate complicated fires. And a lot of this stuff was urban renewal type fires.
Sure.
So
interesting.
Did you have a lot of cooperation between different departments, or was it hard to get all the pieces together at that point?
It varied quickly. You had to do your personal relationships.
Yeah.
You know, the bosses would meet with bosses, but we'd work side by side with individuals from the state fire marshals and all the local towns and cities. And some places were much easier than others. I mean, you can't blame a place like Boston not trusting the feds. I mean, when you watch TV for years, you see the FBI always taking something over, you know, and not sharing that type of thing. So they didn't know what ATF was. Nobody did.
Well, I was going to say ATF has always been a very necessary law enforcement agency, but it seems like it's had a history of potentially being on the chopping block a couple of times where they were going to get rid of the agency. And, you know, thankfully they didn't, because I think that's understanding the scope of what ATF and now explosives does, it's very important to have that specialized, thing. But like I said, there was a time where, was it back even in the 90s, they were worried about losing.
Many times. Ronald Reagan was in New Hampshire, and we were on the same podium protecting him, and he's telling the New Hampshire people that he's going to get rid of ATF. And we're right there with him. But, it's not just the gun stuff, but the fire stuff really had a good niche.
Yeah.
And the explosive stuff.
So you were saying, you went from guns to fire. I mean, what was that catalyst for you? I mean, what fueled, no pun intended, your desire to get into fire investigation?
I just immediately recognized it would be a nice niche to be in.
Gotcha.
Something different. I mean, other ATF guys always made fun of you. Yeah, you got your fire extinguisher with you today,
right.
not your gun. But it was fun. I mean, it was something that we had classes right in the beginning, not just origin and cause stuff, because we weren't really into origin and cause until the middle to late 80s.
Okay.
But the early part, we were doing arson for profit classes for state and locals and for ATF agents. And I did go to National Fire Academy for origin and cause from 1980, 81, and also the State Fire Academy, those type of things. But it was just something, it was more in depth, and I just liked to work something different than the gun cases. Gun cases were either paper chases because somebody falsified a form or something like that, or you were buying stolen guns on the street, doing undercover work.
Yeah, and fire investigation, I mean, especially like arson for profit, things like that. I mean, you're working the street and you're working the people. You said that before. You enjoyed the interview process of dealing with the owner to the homeless guy in the street, digging through the piles. And, I guess it was always something different every time you probably hit the street, I could only imagine.
Every single fire. And again, I started taking an interest in origin cause.
Right.
And that's why I volunteered in 1986 for the very first CFI, Certified Fire Investigator program that ATF put on, a 2-year program. You had to have 100 fires in your background already and 160 hours within that 2 years of training.
I feel like I got that in 82. We're good.
Yeah. So, every fire I went to, I saw it as a puzzle.
Right.
And you had so many pieces to put together. And, there's a lot of times when there's a piece missing, don't you hate that piece missing in the puzzle?
Right.
You can't find it. You're looking on the floor underneath the couch.
I get it.
Well, it's the same thing with fires. There's something missing. What don't we have? And that was always the most fun.
Yeah, and that time frame, late 70s, early 80s, I mean, were you guys kind of writing the script too? I mean, I have to think that it's not, obviously things progress over time, but as ATF became newer to the fire investigation side, I have to think that you guys, with the federal backing, would allow you to find new ways, new methodologies, new testing. I mean, that probably all came through your tutelage, I would think.
You're exactly right. The federal government doesn't always do the right thing, but the arson program, I always felt they did the right thing.
Yeah.
The money was always there. They trained us every single year, and you could get as much outside training and in-house training every single year. And what happened was, when guys were doing fire investigation in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, they learned it from the older firefighters who said that spalling was this, or said the kneeling of springs was this, and there was no science behind it. And at the same time, in the early 80s, the fire scientists of UMaryland and other schools were researching and doing a lot of work on fire and fire growth and that type of thing. And somebody from ATF contacted UMaryland, and we built this partnership with them where we took classes down there, and with Dr. Quinteri, who wrote one of the great books, Fred Maurer, those guys. And we started meeting other people and studying and learning that, fire grows in this fashion. And that's just the origin and cause. And we also had to learn how to do a fire investigation from beginning to end. We're investigators, we're trained criminal investigators. How many fire and police departments actually joined together prior to the 1980s to investigate fires?
Right.
Yeah.
Very few. Now there's teams everywhere because they realize that the police are trained investigators, and the fire guys, the firemen, firefighters are trained at fires. So you start cross-training.
Sure, makes sense.
Working together.
Do you use the labs at University of Maryland then?
We use the fire training program and their fire buildings.
Yeah, because their labs are amazing.
Yeah,
there.
but ATF has a good lab. 2 good labs. I know. And we have one of the biggest fire. You can put a whole building inside the ATF lab now and burn it. That's how big
and where
it
is that?
It's in Maryland, but I can't remember what town it's in now. Yeah.
We'll go.
It sounds,
You want to see it?
Absolutely.
It sounds like and this is what I love, is the evolution, right? As things change all the time, with technology and education. But it seemed like it went from street smart know-how, senior guy passes it to the next guy, like you were talking about, to through your time frame, it went more to an educational side, tried and true methodology, education and training, and so on, and which is probably where we are today now. Is we're highly scientific.
NFPA 921 came out in the beginning of the 90s.
Okay.
And evolved to what we have today. Like, what are we up to, the 8th edition or 10th edition?
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't keep track.
Right. But that did put pressure on people to be more scientific at the same time. And, just some things around the OJ trial.
Yep.
And that forced people to become more scientific. You just can't say something. It just because I've seen it 100 times, it doesn't always happen that way, Yeah. And that's what people used to say. People beyond the stand say, I've seen that 1,000 times, but that's not how you testify, and doesn't get you anyplace anymore.
I think it has a lot to do, too. I mean, people watch television, right? So it's Hollywood, and it's not really how trials work, and it's not really how investigations work, there's a lot more know-how and methodology and ingenuity that's got to go into your skills. 25 years in a week.
Yes.
In the ATF.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
And now you've been working privately as a fire.
Last 18 years as a fire explosion analyst.
Right. Absolutely. Your own. That's a testament to the years of experience and so on. I thought I read in your book too, which was pretty interesting, that you investigated over 2,300 fire and explosion scenes.
And that number
that's a big number.
Pretty accurate, and I'll tell you why. ATF mandated that we keep count.
Oh, no kidding.
And then when I went on the private side, I had the big blotter on my desk.
Sure.
And I'll bet you I had 10 years stacked together.
The blotters.
And I would put what the address was, the case number, and the person's last name for every single fire I went to. And that's how I counted.
Wow.
So going back to 1982 in March, this arson task force is formed, and you volunteer for this.
Yes.
And this is kind of what we were talking about a little bit before, driven from this urban decay and this situation going on in America on this whole, like, America's burning. And so they kind of dump you into this, and that coincides with this 2.5% tax cap law that was passed in Massachusetts. And for the book, for Burn, Boston, Burn, our conspiracy starts with our conspirators to start set these fires.
Isn't it an amazing coincidence, actually? And people don't believe in coincidence, but this is one that's real. The ATF Arson Task Force in Boston, and Boston was one of only a half a dozen cities or so, New York, Chicago, L.A., maybe 4 cities, had the Arson Task Force with ATF. And we started in March of 82, and their first fire from these conspirators was February of 1982. They didn't know that we were forming an arson group. We didn't know they were out setting fires.
That's incredible.
So,
that's incredible.
What happened? They ramped up their...
Unfortunate for them.
Yeah.
They should have gone to another city.
Because of Proposition, and I explain to your listeners, Proposition 2.5 was a tax-cutting measure and was passed by the citizens of Massachusetts. to cap your property taxes at 2.5% of its value, and it couldn't jack up real high any 1 year. There's guidelines for that. And when it first came into being, the cities and towns had to cut somewhere because they didn't know where the money was going to come from initially. So who usually gets cut? Police, fire, and school teachers.
Right.
And the city of Boston had about 1,700 firefighters at the time. And they lost 600 men at that point in time, 600 people. A couple hundred through rapid attrition and another 400 through layoffs. So that's a very deep cut. And along with that, firehouses are closed and fire companies are just sitting there idle. So this particular group, they're fire buffs. Now, again, people don't understand fire buffs. And you have to explain that in the book, in a sense. People collect things in life. You know, people collect Beanie Babies and books. I'm a book collector. I have 1,000 hardcovers in my library.
Right.
And but fire buffs like to watch firefighting operations, like to take pictures, like to collect memorabilia, equipment, that type of thing. Some people do run to fires, and back then when Boston was burning, there were locations where fire buffs would hang out at night and just wait for the calls to come in. And this particular group, who formed a conspiracy, became a militant group. And they weren't all liked by some of the other firefighters and fire buffs. A couple of them were loud, boisterous, nasty. But other ones had a lot of close friends. They used to go to the Fire Buffs picnic. A couple of them were members of the Boston Sparks Association.
It's Boston Sparks Association, right?
So for Sparks, I mean, for anybody listening that's not from the New England area, Spark is a fire buff, right? Anywhere else in the country, you know, there's different names for them all over, but Boston has that unique term of being a Spark is a buff.
Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's a lot of famous Sparks.
Sure.
And Arthur Fiedler, the maestro, was one of the most famous Sparks in the Boston area.
So I remember reading in the book that like one of the like on top of Proposition 2.5 getting passed, like they closed companies down, and I forget which.
22 fewer fire companies.
Yes.
Closed. 22 companies were closed, over 600 men.
But I forget which fire, which arsonist was, and which fire. But he said like there's a closed house, and he watched somebody die.
Yes.
And he knew that if that firehouse would have been, or you know, he believed, I should say, that if that firehouse would have been open, the people would have stood a better chance of surviving the fire. And it was a boundary that got crossed, because that's one thing with Sparks or fire buffs is they don't interfere with fire operations and they don't help. But it was so dire in that situation that I think it was the district chief or whatever said like, hey, we get over here and help. And you know, unfortunately, somebody succumbed to this the injuries from the fire, and it seemed like it was this motivation for them that they felt they needed to take action. And I think you even said like to call it like that Boston patriotic pride of like being like, we're going to do something. And
absolutely. I mean, you know, home of the American Revolution type of thing. But yeah, it was Greg Bemis you're talking about in particular, and he went to 2 fires within a month's time where there were fatalities. And one of the fires, he pulls away from the fire scene. He knows where all the firehouses are anyway, but right around the corner from that fire, in front on the door is painted, on the overhead doors, is painted closed, you know, that type of thing. And he was very young. He was probably, just 81. He was 21 years old and very impressionable. And he really felt badly about it and got angry that this happened. And, you know, that's what sparks people in a sense. Again, no pun intended. But people are called to arms, you know. And the firehouses that were closed, one in Hyde Park, one in East Boston, people actually held those hostage. They actually stayed right there and wouldn't let any city officials cross the line until they reopened those.
Is that right?
Yes.
Wow.
They blocked the tunnel. You know the old tunnels?
Yes.
Yep.
Some of them in Callahan tunnels. They actually blocked the tunnels.
Wow.
You know?
Yeah.
So really interesting time. I think what I would like to do is just paint a picture a little bit, right? I mean, we're all familiar with the book. Have you read the whole thing?
Yeah.
Okay. So Rob's done. I'm certainly going to be picking up and getting through it but it's a lengthy book with a lot of information and a lot of detail, which I love. And so maybe we could just hit on it a little bit. You talked about these spark groups, and there were other spark groups that weren't involved in the arson spree, or what would you call it?
I think
spree is a good
would
one.
you even say like that? There's the Sparks Association and the Spark Groups, and these guys were considered themselves sparks, but they were really arsonists. I mean, at the end, like they started out as buffs and then they transformed into this, because it's something you said in the book. You don't want people to confuse a spark with a criminal.
So
these fires, and they'd set up to 7 multiple alarm fires in one night. Okay. And my second daughter was born June 25th, 1982. I think that night they set 6 fires, and several of them were multiple alarms. Wow. And but they stayed sparks throughout in a sense, but they also had the other title being arsonists. Mm-hmm. Fire buffs turned arsonists type of thing.
But there were different groups of sparks,
absolutely,
if you will, right?
We had the Boston Sparks Association. A lot of members were out there nightly because it was entertainment.
Well, it's like Detroit, right? When Devil's Night, when Detroit burns. I mean, there's tons and tons of people that go just for the sport of it, if you will, which is an interesting concept.
Well,
but
how many?
I get it.
Again, how many lay people actually? If you see a fire, the lay people stand there and watch it too.
Absolutely.
I mean,
You're right.
people who understand it a little more, being fire buffs, again, they're watching firefighters and watching how they're operating, or watching if they're succeeding or failing against these fires, that type of thing. Watching the actual fire develop through a building. So there's a lot to it.
Yeah, no, I understand. I've done plenty of buffing myself over the years, so no doubt. No doubt. Now, this time frame was June, right? I mean,
it started in February of 80.
February of
82.
But it really ramped up in the summer.
Right through the summer. By October, they had set already 100 building fires. Yeah. And when we talk 264 fires, we're only talking structure fires, because they had set a couple hundred dumpster fires. And if you're familiar with a lot of cities, the dumpsters are right in the back alleys, right behind the buildings. So they would just run down that alley in a vehicle and just toss a delay device into one dumpster after another. When you get to the end or across the Charles River, you could stand there on the other side of the river and watch the fires glowing in all the different dumpsters along the way. That's
incredible. And I just to put it in perspective, so what I have in front of me, a good friend of ours, Steve Kalman, Deputy Chief, retired out of Hackensack, New Jersey, is a big historian when it comes to firefighting. And he reached out, and I would have loved to have had him here tonight, and he couldn't make it. But he's teaching tonight. Yeah. However, I know you and he have had some interaction back and forth and conversations. We have. Yeah. And Deputy Chief Kalman, who was really into it, and so we chatted. I stopped there today, and I picked up his one book called Smoke Showing from William Noonan, who is a famed spark, right? Was he a
spark? But he was on a job in Boston. Okay. Yeah. And he was the photographer for almost 30 years.
Right, and he's famous for his photography, especially for Boston fires, Boston area fires, things like that. And then I also have an article from Firehouse Magazine, September of 1982 issue, and just a clipped out section about these fires. And just to put it in perspective for people listening, I mean, when you talk about June of 1982, with this arson spree that was going on with this group of how many were there? There were in that group.
The arsonists?
Yes.
8 of them were arsonists, and then there was a 9th conspirator.
Okay. So 8 arsonists running around as a group. I mean, this is a group of arsonists that were working to burn Boston down, really. And in June of 1982 alone, in 1 month, they had 5 working fires, 6 second alarms, 7 third alarms, 2 fourths, 2 fifths, 3 sixths, 1 seventh, and 2 ninth alarms. It's outrageous. And then if you go through the dates on them, right, you look at like June 11th. June 11th alone, they had a 9th alarm, 6th alarm, 3 alarm, and a 5 alarm all on the same day.
Same night.
Same night. Not even a 24-hour
day. Between midnight and 5 a.m.
Midnight and 5 a.m. And that was their MO, right? I mean, there were a lot of overnight fires.
Yes, all of them.
Usually by 5 in the morning, the sun was coming up and they were going back to bed.
So this thing started ramping up. I mean, they started in February. I mean, I'm sure that's where you traced it back to, being an investigator. But it really ramped up over the summer. When did you become involved? I mean, when was the ATF? Somebody knocked on your door and said, "Hey, we might need some help here."
In the spring, for sure.
Okay.
We had already formed a relationship with Boston. The state fire marshal wasn't really involved because the fires were happening in Boston at that point in time, and mass fire marshals didn't come into the city much. So once we realized there was a major uptick in fires, we'd have meetings with Boston. We just really didn't have a clue who was doing it. And, we couldn't help think that laid off firefighters, union guys, that type of thing might be involved. Not particularly fire buffs. I didn't know much about fire buffs in '82. And we just ran from fire to fire. Boston did most of the initial ones because they were abandoned house fires, triple-deckers, 2 families. And so we weren't really as involved with those until June 3rd of 1982, the Sparrow Toy Company, an entire industrial city block, 1,000 feet long, 300 feet wide.
Wow.
That building burned, and it had cheap imported toys in cardboard boxes. And they set the fire on the outside rear along the railroad tracks. It carried inside the building. And because of its interstate commerce aspect, that's how ATF would get involved in investigating. And we had the national response team, very first time in Boston, came to that fire. Dave Ikove, Dr. Dave, was actually our origin and cause person. And I worked with him on that particular fire for origin and cause. But you interview the owners, you interview disgruntled employees, you interview passerby who saw it, that type of thing. But we really didn't have a good suspect when we were done.
Right.
And we didn't have one throughout the summer. It was early fall when we got our first break.
Now, in that interview portion of this, so as you're doing investigations, I mean, and you've done at least like 5 or 6, no, you've done hundreds of interviews, right? I mean, like, when do you usually pick up on, like, when you got a good feel, like you come in and you sit Jeremy down and you say, hey, like, we got to talk about this, it's all standard for whatever your back pocket lines are that you use. How long is it usually? Is there a thing where you usually say, like, you know what, I've got a feeling about this guy, or like, is it a certain time frame into the interview where you really start to develop that intuition that the suspect, because like I said, you're interviewing all these owners and like I said, the homeless person, the cabbie, the owner of the property, like, and you're just getting to nowhere. But how long does it usually take for that to, like, kind of start building up on somebody that you're like, man, this guy's involved?
If you have a person in front of you that doesn't seem right, and they don't seem right because of body language and the way they're answering questions, or the way they're going on and on and on about other unrelated topics, trying to get you off the topic, off the question. If they're actually involved with the building in some way, again, we'd ask them to take a polygraph based on that feeling that, if you take the polygraph, at least we can eliminate you.
We'll clear you.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. And, it can't be used against you in court in almost any jurisdiction. And we tell them that. And we tell them there's no games. They ask you questions ahead of time and show you what it's about. And if you happen to fail it because you're nervous, they always claim they're nervous.
Of course.
They are nervous. But if you fail it, it just gives us another opportunity to interview you. And once you catch a person in 1 or 2 lies, and it's not as easy as today. Today you can catch people in lies because of their cell phone, because of their GPS, because of the TV cameras on the street.
Everywhere.
And that's why this case couldn't really happen like it did.
Right. Now, I have to think, though, I mean, you guys went through the summer without a chief suspect. That, for investigators with the amount of property loss, right?
Yes.
You guys really were probably reeling and like, we got to figure this out. I mean, there had to be a lot of frustration, I can only imagine.
And some pressure starting to mount.
Oh, I bet. I bet.
Not just from the people of Boston, but the higher-ups. And eventually, Congress actually was watching this case. They were being fed every day by headquarters and told what's going on in Boston.
Well, this turned out to be the country's largest arson case, correct?
That's a direct quote. Actually, I should have that quotation marks on the front page, on the cover. The U.S. Attorney said this was the largest arson case in the history of the country.
Wow.
And initially, my son-in-law who designed this cover accidentally put the United States up there. That's not the quote. Okay. And somebody, Mike Foley, who wrote Busy as Hell, said, what country are we talking about? He said it should say the United States. I said, no, it's a direct quote.
Yep.
Bill Weld was the U.S. Attorney back then and became governor and has run for president.
Sure.
So, but we were frustrated. We were confused.
Yeah.
We were, again, running around like chickens with our heads cut off because you had so many fires to contend with.
Were you out at night patrolling, sitting in dark alleys? I mean, I have to think, right? You guys were pulling out all the stops,
all the above. We had people on top of buildings.
Right.
I was on top in South Boston because there was a rash in South Boston going on, and we were on top of some of the industrial buildings. We had binoculars. We had radios to the teams down below and vehicles, and where to get us. Actually, no fires occurred right in that area, so maybe something was going on. Maybe they were tipped off somehow.
Right.
Remember, one of the arsonists was an actual Boston firefighter.
Yeah.
So were they getting information? And they all had friends. So not intentionally giving information, but just friend to friend saying, oh, yeah, the arson squad's beefed up. They're out tonight.
But I have to think, too, though, it was all over the news. People were talking. I mean, there's a rash of fires. The public is, as a whole, is getting nervous and frightened. So the media is going to be all over it. So I mean, they know that the police and the government's out in force. I have to believe. So
the local news came up with the name somewhere, Friday Firebug, because a lot of the fires were set Thursday night into Friday morning, and then it took them a while, but they started spreading it out afterwards because we concentrated surveillance efforts.
Interesting.
Was
there certain sections that were targeted more so than like the empty companies, the companies that were downsized or closed? Were those areas impacted more so?
Another good question. You guys know what you're talking about. Well, they started with the abandoned buildings first, and part of the reason was less likely to hurt anybody, including firefighters. And a lot of times they won't go inside the abandoned buildings to fight the fires, knowing that people aren't living there. So those buildings happen to be in the poorer sections, which were Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, Jamaica Plain.
Right.
Parts of South Boston had quite a few. So they would hit those first. And then they spread out to other buildings, including businesses.
Right.
What was the question?
The question was, did they target the areas where the shuttered firehouses were?
Then, actually, in March of '82, they stole their first firebox off a pull box, a voice alarm box. Okay, they started stealing them for the main reason of setting a fire in that area, and it'd be a delayed response. Sure. Now, think back to 1982. You don't have cell phones.
Right.
People are sleeping in the middle of the night. You're not going to knock on a neighbor's door in somebody's neighborhoods in the middle of the night. So you have to find a payphone somewhere or a next call box down a few blocks away. So it delayed response, and the fire could grow bigger. So they would do that. And then with the firehouses closed, they would pull the firefighters over to one area.
Yeah.
And knowing the houses are closed and they're all busy over here, then they'd set more fires in those areas.
Yeah.
Intentionally. These guys knew not only the locations of all the fireboxes, they knew all the firehouses that were closed.
Well, they're sparks, right? I mean, this is what they do. I mean, they know the infrastructure of the Boston City Fire Department probably more so than a lot of their own members.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Very true.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Because they were citywide guys.
Right.
Whereas, a firefighter's in a fire company for a few years before he's maybe in another fire company,
Do you find with serial arsonists, they start small and they work their way up? Because you said they started, dumpsters, and there were other, miscellaneous type fires. Then they would start with abandoned structures, and then they got, it seems like, more aggressive into occupied businesses or shut down businesses for the night. But there's a big dollar loss there. I mean, it seems like there was a progression.
There definitely was, because they wanted the media coverage too.
Okay.
In this case, other serial arsonists typically, typically start where they're comfortable. Around the neighborhood.
Local, yeah.
And you're right, they would do something small, a dumpster, a shed, or something like that. And then once they realized they got away with it, they would go something a little bigger.
They gain a little more confidence.
Right.
Yeah.
And they'd move out, spread away from the house as they get more comfortable doing it.
And I think that was one of the things I picked up in the book was that whole, like, your normal MO that you're looking for is this, like, concentrated. My house is here and I'm within, but they were, like you said, they were citywide.
Just think of it. These guys were partial law enforcement. Some of them, three of them ended up being police officers and fire buffs. They knew the city. Yeah. And then once the city got hot, they went outside the city and set four multiple alarm fires in one night in Fitchburg and 3 in Lawrence, north of Boston, and another one in Lowell. And then they'd hit 2 in Quincy, 2 in Cambridge, 2 in Everett, 2 in Canton.
Yeah.
They went all over the place. Yeah. And they got very comfortable because they're driving around in their mock police cruisers.
That's what cracked me up, too, when I heard that, right?
The Nerf cruisers, right?
The Nerf cruisers is the term that we gave it.
Do you know, where did that come from?
Terry Barry, Special Agent Terry Barry. Nerf cruisers.
What's the Nerf stand for? How did that come
remember
about?
the Nerf ball and everything and stuff like that? It was very popular back then. A Nerf ball is not a real ball in a sense.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And a cruiser is not a real cruiser, but it looked like a real cruiser. And as a matter of fact, you wanted a crazy point? They went to Natick Ford, west of Boston, because they had a relationship out there. They went there in the middle of the night and stole a brand new unmarked cruiser out of the lot, stole parts off it to update their personal cruiser, and then dumped it into the Fort Point Channel, which is right main part of the city.
Unbelievable.
Into the channel.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
Now, around that time, weren't they taking down the Orange Line, too, in Jamaica Plain? So
some of the train tracks were coming down at that point in time.
So would that have anything to do with it as far as not being able to get to sites and knowing, how the department operated? Because they're around the zoo too. Then,
well, what was going on? One thing then was the extension of Route 95. They were planning on building the Southwest Corridor. That's what they called it. And it never came true. Underneath the ground there now, they do have train tracks under the ground, so there's a lot of construction in that whole area, and there's a park on top now, and they took down a lot of houses in that area. Yeah. Right, so there was those areas they could not get through as easily as they could before.
So this roving group of Sparks, now arsonists, they roamed in a group, in a pack, right? I mean, they're driving Nerf cruisers, which are mocked up old retired police cars, right?
Yep. With one of them's got a license plate that says Arson, right? I mean,
the Boston firefighter had Arson on his plate.
Oh my! You just can't make this stuff up. That's wild.
And the local PDs thought he was a member of the Arson squad because he had Arson on the plate.
Sure, makes it right.
Yeah,
yeah, right.
So
the progression? So you guys are struggling in the summer. June, July, you're struggling to find a suspect or a lead, right? And you're chasing down, I'm sure, every possible loose end you could find. And how did you become familiar with this group?
Okay. The big break happened on November 21, 1982. Garrity Lumber 2, we call it, because a month earlier they'd burned Garrity Lumber already. Yeah. Had a major fire. So on November 21, they set this blazing fire, and I have video of this that we show during my speaking events.
Right.
And Nat Whittemore was a WBZ TV cameraman, and he happens to be doing a job that he loves. As a cameraman, he's also a fire buff.
Okay.
So he was out every night working and responding to fires. And he went to the lumberyard fire with Ed Fowler, who's now passed away. He was a Cambridge fire investigator. And they got to that fire out there on November 21, and they separated because they saw some tracks over the grass where there was a heavy frost. And they said, it didn't seem right, So Nat took one way, Ed took another way, and when Nat came around the corner, he saw 4 guys or so on a lumber pile. And he recognized some of them as Sparks, guys he knows. But they're always the loud ones. They rooted for the home team. The home team is the fire. The firefighters are the one who are visiting the scene, right? but they would root for the home team. Okay. And they were being loud and crazy. And Nat's looking at him, and not too far away, 50, 60 feet away. And he has his camera, and he starts to swing it over. And the Boston police officer, not in uniform, but in an old green army jacket, pulls out a sidearm and lifts it. So Nat momentarily is in fear for his life.
Wow.
And then he raises it over his head and waves it around for a couple seconds as if he's on a bucking bronco and acting crazy.
Yeah.
And the other guys are sort of laughing and hiding their face and stuff like that. And they realize Nat's filming them. So he puts it back in, and he just sits there. And they call over, there's a local Dedham police officer because Garrity's on the Hyde Park Dedham Mass line. And the cop goes over, and Grubluski, the one who waved his gun, identifies himself as a Boston police officer. So the Dedham cop didn't do anything, just said, put it away, don't do that again. So nothing happened. But what did happen is Nat came back to his office, to the studio, told his bosses. They invited Boston Fire, Boston Police, and ATF. We actually saw raw footage the next day or so. And who's that, and that, who's that, and who's that? So I went to interview the Boston police officer 4 days later or so, about a week later.
Yeah.
And we interviewed him with my partner, Billy Murphy, at this guy's apartment in Weymouth, Mass. And we knock on the door, and he opens the door and invites us in, very cordial. We tell him what we're there for. You're a Boston cop. We're cops. You're hanging out with these guys. Did you hear anything? Do you know anything? That type of thing. And with the best of them, he just lied straight to our face. But he had a firebox on the floor, one of the stolen fireboxes, number 1712, the first one stolen actually in March of '82. And my partner there, Billy, said, "Oh, my grandfather makes lamps out of those or something." And he walks over and records the number in his head.
Sure.
And we actually head back into Boston, and now it's like 9:30 at night. We head back into Boston, not where we needed to be. And Billy had a list of the stolen boxes.
Sure.
In any one year, there's only one or two missing in Boston, and they're all considered, if a car hits the pole or something like that, but they're considered stolen property.
Right.
So that year there were 14 of them missing because these guys were stealing them. And so we got a local warrant the next day. Boston PD was not happy about that.
No, I bet.
And
my goodness.
They accompanied us, but they weren't happy. As a matter of fact, as soon as we walked into the apartment, we were led into the apartment this time. Bobby wasn't home. And the box was still there on the floor. Why is it still there?
Yeah, why would...
yeah. Is he...
For the intent of you going to this guy's apartment, and, I think to myself, like, if this guy would have covered this box up, would have put it anywhere else, and you guys sat down with him and talked to him, like, how... and that's why I asked that question before about when you're interviewing somebody, if you really think like, hey, maybe this guy's got do you think it would have put you off that much more into the investigation?
We probably would have knocked on the other guys' doors, the other ones identified, which we ended up doing shortly thereafter anyway, because he didn't tell us anything. And he came in with an attorney and took a polygraph a week later and miserably failed it. And so I said to his attorney, just said to me, he can't talk.
Yeah.
And I said, what does that mean? He can't talk. And he said, I can't tell you anything else. He can't talk. And we were starting to fiddle around again. We started knocking on the doors of a couple other ones. And I got one of them to be a source of information. And he was another police officer. And you can't have them as official informants because they're a police officer.
Right.
So. Why was that? That was one part that I didn't quite understand. Like, now, is it a legal thing, or is it?
It's just I don't know. It's regulations. I don't know what it's based on.
Okay.
At this point in time. But so I would talk to him by phone or visit him or that type of thing. But he would tell me tidbits such as, oh, these guys burned an abandoned stolen car in South Boston. And that excited me about as much as watching paint dry.
Yeah.
You know? So, oh yeah, well, they burned a car and it caught onto a building. He told me that sometime later on. A little more excited, but not much. Well, Donald Stackpole, the owner of a security company, is going to burn some of the company cars for insurance. And, you know, that's insurance fraud, and it's mail fraud under federal guidelines because mailings that happen with your insurance stuff, you know, if you cause them in any way. So we're waiting for that. And we actually put a wire on this guy in the summer of 83 and put a wire on him. But something kept happening with the wire. It just seemed to cut out all the time. And our tech guy said, Wayne,
something's going on.
He was playing with you.
Yeah.
So I had a double agent in my hand, and I, you know, he's my source.
Yep.
And I felt like crap.
Yeah,
I get teams out there, and we're trying to wire this guy and all this stuff.
Now, during that time, were the fires slowing?
They slowed during 83, mainly because of the heat that we did put on right after the gun waving incident and the interviewing and all that. A lot of the guys had been rehired, not all of them, and only a couple fire companies got reopened and reactivated. Boston still never reactivated some of those fire companies today. So this guy told me about the car being dumped in the channel, and we got the Boston dive team. And the dive team recovered the vehicle for us, along with a couple others that were dumped in the same place.
Nice.
And with that information, we still sat on it for a while because it wasn't juicy enough to put pressure on these guys yet. So we got a new supervisor mid-December of 83. And the new supervisor was a very focused individual. And he came up from D.C. and he said, we have to stop what you guys are doing. We have to focus. We have to get out and talk to these guys and put pressure on them. And so we finally, on January 12th of 1984, got Bobby Grabluski at police headquarters. He was still a police officer, but he was working now in a turret, and they took his firearm away. Turret is dispatch. Okay. So we had Bobby come down to an office with a deputy superintendent, a couple of detectives, and 2 ATF guys. And I don't want to spoil the whole scene.
Sure.
It's a good scene for a movie.
Yeah. I love it.
Okay.
Which we hope to see. Absolutely.
Actually, there's numerous scenes in here that are very worthy, besides fires.
Yeah.
I mean, fires is good, but I mean, you can only watch so many, and they can only pay for so many to make a movie.
Yeah.
But when you have a Boston police officer who just set the 4th fire of a night, and he's laying in the woods in a town outside of Boston, and the state police have swarming the area now, and they pull over and start shining a light in the woods, and the police officer is laying some 20 or 30 feet into the woods and pulls his gun out again and gets ready if the cops come in.
I think that was, you know, in the book, that was the most chilling moment. I mean, because I just, when you wrote that, you know, and you put that account in there, and to me it was like, you know, again, I said, like, one of the strong points of the book was that, you know, you're almost rooting for the bad guys in the beginning, especially with you know, if you're a firefighter out there and you have knowledge of fire behavior, you're like, this is going to be a good job when they're talking about where they're setting the fuel packages up against the gas shingles and stuff.
Isn't it a strange thing to firefighters and fire buffs?
Yeah.
We talk about a good fire.
Right.
I mean, we all understand that somebody's losing their property, their contents, their building, their memories, and injuries and deaths. We understand that. But as firefighters or people who like to watch fires or fire buffs, a good fire is one that just visually looks better. It's one with flames showing rather than smoke. And we call the other ones crap fires in the book. Yeah. And it was a term that these fire buffs used regularly. You know? But it's interesting.
And right in that moment, he's making this, this isn't just like, hey, we're going to light some buildings on fire. It's gone away from that whole aspect of we want to get these guys back on the job. We want to open these companies. he's a law enforcement officer and he's contemplating using a service weapon against another person who's in the law enforcement community. And I literally read that and I put the book down for a second and went, Jesus, how far did this go for these guys? Like, this is like, that's that point of like that moment of clarity, you know, for people to go like, I'm really sick right now. And I was just like, this, like, and it just, it was just crazy. We talked about it on the phone. I said, I can't believe the abandoned recklessness of these guys.
Absolutely. And that was fight or flight,
right,
for him at that point in time. And he doesn't know if he was going to pull the trigger or not for sure. I mean, it came out in trial that this did happen.
Right.
You know, and it's not fantasy. It seems like fiction.
Yeah.
When you're reading a lot of this book, right,
Yeah.
Rob? The dialogue and everything that's in this book seems like fiction, but it's all real dialogue.
I mean, they talked about starting fires and like because like one of the things that is very prevalent throughout the book is that they, in like fire service, they did pre-planning. They went out and they got a list of vacant structures. They were cruising like, and you said at some point it was amazing that some of them had girlfriends and wives because of the time they spent to this. But when they were not in their target days, they were out looking for these addresses and getting these addresses down. So they talk about like lighting fires and being like, hey, Jeremy, we're going to go down here to Dorchester. There's that 3-decker we looked at last week. Just like him and I would be like, you want another vodka and tonic? I think I got another bottle of Kettle One back here. And we'd be like, yeah, let's do it.
But that's all part of it, right? I mean, that's part of the game, right? Is that, you know, they're looking for buildings that are going to provide them the thrill, right? It's the challenge of setting it, the challenge of being able to witness and watch it, and then the challenge to get away with it, right? I mean, I'm not, you know, I don't really know the criminal mind like you do, of course, but, you know, I'm just having to think as a firefighter, we size up a building, we respond to a fire, we look at the surroundings, we look at the construction of the building, we look at fire growth, fire pathways, right? I mean, all these things.
They did exactly the same thing.
Yeah. Right. I find that just incredibly intriguing, and then it makes me a little nervous about myself because I always size up buildings everywhere I go. You know?
and the rooting for the home team aspect of it, like that was the other part of the book that just really blew my mind, was this ability to say like, yeah, we really got them good. Like they got caught. That went to six alarms, or you know, they just struck a 5th over here, and Jim. All right, come on, Tucker, get in the car, let's go.
But they had a bunch of brothers getting injuries.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, there were firefighters getting hurt. There was nobody killed.
Not
correct?
one fatality, no.
Not one fatality.
The grace of God.
But you had a bunch of firefighters. I know I read a snippet where there was a wall collapse. I think 5 guys.
There was a roof collapse.
A roof collapse.
And 22 firefighters in total were hurt.
Okay.
Several of them fell down through the roof, broken backs and broken legs. That was a turning point for a lot of people. That was October 2nd of 82 in South Boston. And it really angered the investigators and the fire department. And again, it was still another month before we got the lucky break, you know. Right. But still, it was another 14 months before we made the first arrest.
Yeah. Can you talk about the emotional roller coaster as the investigator, right? I mean, you're the lead. I mean, you're the guy, and it's falling. You know, all the higher ups are coming down on you. And Wayne, what are we doing here? Like, you know, I have to think your personal life. I mean, you probably lived, ate, slept this case.
You even had to pay for your own gas at some points, right?
Yeah, because with budget cuts, federal budget cuts, they only gave us $25 in a week for gas. And Deputy Superintendent Jack Gifford, the same superintendent who was in the office when Grabluski confesses, he used to let me use the Boston pump outside his precinct. Type of thing. Once a week, he'd fill me up, which was very helpful.
Yeah. Sure.
But I'd ride with his anti-crime unit and stuff like that, too, so I wouldn't use a lot of gas by riding with his guys.
But it had to take an emotional toll on you.
Oh, like I even mentioned
the
night my daughter's born, my second daughter. Here I am. You know, he's supposed to be with I had a 1-year-old girl and my newborn and my wife, and my mind is out there with the 6 multiple alarms they set that night. Yeah. You know, and it was draining. I mean, we spent a lot of hours back then. Once the first arrest was made, I would say my hours almost doubled at that point. It was just up and down, up and down. And when the new supervisor came in, here I am. I'm 30 years old at the time. I'm on the job 6 years total. and you're still learning. As
Yeah,
you get in the arson business and you're learning.
30 is still young.
Yeah.
I'm 42 right now. I consider myself young still, so 30's young.
Right.
Yeah.
And at some point, you feel inadequate in a sense. You feel I'm not doing the right thing, and what should I be doing more? And if I should I be more aggressive? Because I'm not, by nature, I'm not an aggressive guy.
Right.
Okay. And what else should we be doing? But then again, that's part, the supervisors should be supervising for that too at the same time. And we still were chasing fire after fire after fire.
Unbelievable. I'm just trying to picture it in my own head, right? Like the book, there's a lot of verbiage and a lot of detail in there. And so I'm excited to read it and really get the gist of all the storytelling. I read some snippets out of the Firehouse articles and a couple other things that I saw online. But I'm just, you're very calm, and I'm sure that has to do with a lot of your just your 25 years in the ATF. You've done a lot of cases and so on. I mean, you're very straightforward, matter of fact, and level, but at that time, man, I mean, imagine just driving around Boston and in the little cities outside of Boston and waiting for that next fire to pop up or where they are. I mean, I can't even. It's really hard to figure out.
You'd be driving around during the day, whether you're going to do an interview or just going to the office, and you are thinking about what's going to happen today.
Yeah.
Right. At the Spiro Toy Fire in the book, you talk about how the fire set, and it almost looked like it was an outside fire, and it kind of got away from the first engine company, and then it goes to this multiple alarm fire, and then when the fire commissioner struck the 9th alarm, there was cheering. Now at that point, was that cheering from like all of the sparks because this incident happened and they were like, you gotta call the guys in, or was it just from a ring of conspirators? No, it was all the sparks and maybe even some of the firefighters who were working. When these fires are happening, if you're not calling a second alarm or a third alarm, because you're only coming out there with a couple firefighters and an officer, in one truck, something like that, and many times the conspirators, the fire buffs, they said, that's the biggest 2-alarm fire that Boston ever had, because it should have been called a third and something like that.
Yeah.
So you don't have that many 9-alarm fires. And so every piece of apparatus, and there was a major fire already in Dorchester, 2 triple-deckers side by side, because they set it right between the two of them, and there was only a walkway between the two.
Gasoline siding, right? Shingles.
Yes.
Shingles, yeah.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, for an investigator, you guys had a cringe when you see those buildings in these neighborhoods with that, right? I mean,
there were so many you wouldn't believe.
Right.
I didn't believe.
Yeah.
And, most of those are gone nowadays.
As an investigator, can you just hit on that real quick? Because we might have some younger listeners that that maybe don't understand or haven't really seen them because they're not prevalent anymore.
Right.
Some inner cities still have some homes with them left, I got to believe, but for the most part, I mean, they're not really in circulation, if you will. They're not prevalent to a lot of our listeners. So maybe you could just touch on that for me, Wayne.
Back in the 1940s and 50s, they would side a lot of the exterior siding of the houses with shingles that looked much like your roof shingles, except they were a different size. And that's made from a petroleum product.
Right.
And, it's solid gasoline in a sense. And they're actually called asphalt shingles, just like the ones on your roof nowadays. A lot of people have. But if you put a device, a fuel load next to these shingles, and because they're in a vertical configuration, that fire would grow rapidly from the ground level right up to the roof line in a matter of a couple minutes.
Yeah, you're 3 stories and you're about 3 feet apart from.
Yeah, you got triple deckers with a 36-inch, 48-inch alleyway between them.
You got
fire in between them.
You got the radiating energy stop between the two of them, and you got the radiant energy and catching on both, and
it goes right
you're
up,
off to the races.
Eaves and it's off to the races.
That's right.
And the fuel package that they were using, it was one of the things that I kept just really my mind got hung up on because of like I think of modern CSI, right? Like they're gonna come in and take samples of everything, and they're gonna go to the lab, and they're gonna come back with a list and be like, all right, we figured out that it's this fuel. It can only be bought from this place, and there's only 6 people who with credit cards who did it that day.
It's television.
But yeah, it's television.
Well, we have a lot of bombing cases.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing. We've gone over to Radio Shack and came up with the receipt, and because you used a servo remote control. So that's how we catch people a lot of time.
Yeah.
But
So,
in this device, they did use a Coleman fuel as the liquid accelerant. And it was very simple. Just carry a brown paper bag, and they had tissue, and they had a matchbook and a cigarette laced through the matches. And I'm not telling anything out of school anymore because, A, it was in the trial.
Right.
B, it's in my book.
Right.
C, it was in magazines and newspapers once these guys get arrested, court documents, and the internet. So it's nothing. I'm not like telling anybody how to make a
Did
device.
they all use the same style of device, or was it
in this case?
Yeah.
Oh, they started using that right away.
Okay.
The only thing that was different, they would try to place it inside or outside, just place in that bag. And what they do is light the cigarette at the last moment and lace it through the matches.
Right.
And the tissue would get going, and then the fuel. And the fuel just sort of leaks out, and you're getting the gases going. You know, you don't burn the liquid, but you're getting the gases of those fuels get going, and you now have a good first fuel to catch on to any combustibles around. And there's always debris in these abandoned buildings, always trash, always plaster and lath walls, and the walls were stripped, so you have the lath, which is kindling wood, basically.
Yeah.
And then
it's all dried out. It's old buildings.
You know, you put it up against the asphalt siding, but then they added a tire because you could get tire off of any abandoned lot around Boston. And so they throw 2 or 3 in the trunk that night, and they would put a tire, and they'd put the device in the well of the tire. And we tested this at Moon Island, Boston's fire academy.
Interesting.
And once you get going, it starts swirling around inside. The flames start swirling around, and then the tire finally gets, tire you can't just light with a match. So, but once you get the tire going, you got a significant second fuel there now to get a building going. And that made it last much longer to catch on to somebody. They were striking out too often. My only fear with writing this, I had a journal from Greg Bemis, one of the arsonists, and he wrote it in prison. 166 single space typed.
He kept
chronicle.
Track of all his fires?
He wrote it while he was in prison, though.
Oh, okay.
But
right.
I had debriefed Bemis after he confessed and prepped him for trial, and I spent hundreds of hours with him. And what he wrote in there was the same things that he told us, almost word for word. And I always lose my track.
No, that's okay. So word for word, he's writing his journal. He's
talking about the fuel packages with the device. Tires.
My fear with writing the book is not as many firefighters are going to get bogged down in the middle when they're setting fire after fire. But I had a couple of women who read it who were lay people, and they said there was a little bit too much detail. And actually, I had cut out a lot. And when they're out setting 3 or 4 fires in a night and 2 of them don't go anywhere, I put it down to like a single sentence or a single 2-line paragraph type of thing. The reason I kept it in there, and I kept only the juicier nights when they almost got caught or when they fell through the floor or something like that. But those couple lines, and it's just the reiteration, the repetition showed you these guys were at it like 3 or 4 nights a week.
Right.
And they're setting 2 or 3 or 4 or 7 in one night.
If you think about it, right? How many successful 264 fires in a 3-year period, right? How many didn't take off?
Yeah.
How many, weren't discovered or stomped out or or nuisance fires, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Because on top of all the arson fires, Boston Fire and the surrounding communities are still going to all the other normal
right.
runs.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
And it was like there's points in the book, and they talk about being frustrated at the good companies getting there and getting a knock on it because they know what they're doing, and like that, and I don't know, there was just so many contradictions in it that was, like I said, it was just fantastic. Now, kind of moving forward a little bit, because it's something that I don't think people hit on very much, is that you talked about having, like, with Bemis, developing this friendship, debriefing him, preparing him for trial. Like, that's a side of the investigation that I don't think many firefighters ever get a glimpse into, and that was fantastic to see. But can you kind of touch on that? Because you went from, and there's even parts in the book where you say, their words, not mine, and I can almost sense that, like, I don't want to say agitation's not the word, but like, and I don't even want to say resentment, but after all these years, you're still like, yeah, I can't, you're just as shocked as I am that they had this mentality. But what was it like to develop that relationship with somebody like Bemis and say, like, hey, like, we're going to talk about this, and walking through, and then really developing a friendship with them after all these years? I mean, it had to be. It's
a strange relationship. It's hard to explain to people. Here's these guys, you arrest them, and they've lied to your face multiple times, and they lied in grand jury, and they lied up until the moment you arrest them. They even lied after you arrested them. And Bemis was in the same cell with 2 other conspirators for a couple weeks before he decided to finally come clean. And, you know, he's a likable kid. He's a friendly type of guy. He never got... and Grabluski never got angry at us either when we arrested him. They realized it was their fault, in a sense. It's not our fault. We're just doing our job. But there's a lot of people who don't like law enforcement because they're doing their job. But not these guys. But Bemis, when you spend so much time with the kid, and again, I'm 30, he's 22 at that point now, by the time we get him to almost 23. And, you know, he tells you everything. His memory was fantastic. And we'd have the run sheets from the city of Boston. And he said, oh, we're on a spree that night. And that's his word. We were on a spree. And he says, we jumped over the fence, and it was Bobby and me, and it was raining that night. No, I remember there were green shingles on that building. He remembered everything. And we put the device by the back window. And, you know, that type of thing. And we sat with him in the car, and we drove from scene to scene, even so they're vacant lots now or rehab buildings or that type of thing. And what did you do? And we recorded everything right on site at that point. And you're having lunch together, and you're having breakfast together, and you're having dinner together. And you can't be an enemy because you're going to shut him down for one thing.
Right.
But you do develop this weird friendship, you know. And again, he never got angry with us, and he sent us Christmas cards when he went to prison. And he was in contact with Terry Barry in particular because he had a stronger relationship with Terry even. Terry was with me during that whole briefing and debriefing and prepping. Yeah. And then Greg got out of prison. I did not have any contact with him except bumped into him twice. Bumped into him.
Is that right?
Well, he was parked across the street when we were doing a training fire, for one. And I went and knocked on the window. How you doing, Greg? And again, we had a little conversation, friendly. And then I was in a restaurant north of Boston one day with another fire friend. And I came out of the men's room, and somebody was standing in my way. And it was Greg. He had seen me go into the men's room. He was just busting my chop by standing in my way. But it was a friendly kind of conversation.
Wow.
I mean, he testified in 2 trials, and he did a fantastic job in the 2 trials. And again, he didn't hold back at that point, and he knew he was screwed and he was going to prison. He actually got a 30-year sentence initially. Even so, he was testifying and everything else. And then when I was writing the book, I reached out and tried to find him, and I hadn't really contacted him, but when I had my website, I had my phone number on there, and Greg called one day.
No kidding.
Wow. Yep. And I was shocked, and it was a good conversation. We talked for like a half hour the first time. I've been to his house now several times, and we've gone out to dinner.
So he's out now.
Everybody's been
Everybody's out. Okay.
The federal system back then, you were actually eligible after 10 years.
Oh, okay.
And because they actually reduced his sentence afterwards anyway because of his cooperation. But
can you rehabilitate an arsonist?
That's too general a question.
I know. I don't know how else. I mean, you know why? Because it's an addiction, right? I mean, it's the thrill of it, right?
Only for some arsonists. I mean, obviously there's an arson, a serial arsonist, if you're asking that. Can you rehabilitate a serial arsonist? But then these guys were different than other serial arsonists who were doing it for various reasons.
Right.
Whether they do get a thrill, an addiction. These guys were addicted. I mentioned it several times. They were addicted. They were into it. It was nightly entertainment.
Absolutely. And the fact that he remembered every single fire, every placement, every fence he jumped, every device laid. I mean, that to me it's premeditation, and then it's just the memory of the excitement of that experience. I mean, you remember the details of things that enthrall you, right? Like, and I have to think that's you know, where
and Bemis was the most active, right? As out of all, like, was he?
Bemis could have been at probably 260 out of 264 of the fires.
And was Stackpole, was he the second that was, or who was always like, who was his close second as far as riding with him?
Stackpole and Grubluski, the Boston cop.
Right. Okay.
And then the other guys, Wayne Sandin, Boston housing cop. Mm-hmm. He probably about 55. He was my source. Okay. Even when we arrested him, he never confessed. And even when he pled guilty, the judge took his guilty plea without the adjudication that you normally.
Really?
Yes, because he wouldn't say anything about his involvement. Why didn't that kid, again, he was fairly young. He was probably 26 years old at the time that they were setting the fires, around that time period. I don't know the reason today. Why did Wayne Sandin give me tidbits to keep me excited enough with this investigation at that angle and onto these guys? And why did he tell me about the car they dumped and stuff like that, but not tell me, yeah, I was involved with 50 fires. The one that caught on, the car that caught onto a building, that actually only happened late fall of '83, that one. He could have told me that. He could have saved himself years and saved people problems, heartaches, injuries. And he never did. He got a 26-year sentence.
Wow.
Interesting. It's an incredible time period. I mean, you know, I'm thumbing through here. I read some stats before, and just for the firefighter and all of us, right? I mean, I'm looking at it here. This is the June fires, and then you go to, you know, July. I mean, you're talking 21-day period. They went to 4 working fires, several incidents, less serious nature. Let's see here. They had, I mean, I'm just counting. It's 3 alarm, 2 alarm. I mean, just 7 alarms, 9 alarms, 7 alarms, 7 alarm. I mean, these are massive, massive fires. And to go through just some of the numbers too, just to put it in perspective, I mean, Boston's not a massive city.
No.
It's not a big city, right? When we think of the cities in the United States, we think of New York, LA, Chicago, and Boston. Those are like the big 4 that stand out. But in fact, Boston's not a huge city.
No, if you're lucky, it's 4.5, 5 miles across, the same north and south.
Right. So just to put it in perspective, when you're laying off 600 firefighters and closing 55 companies, or closing 22 companies, I mean, they only had 55 companies and 225 firefighters working.
You're cutting out a third of the force.
Right.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, they said that this brought forth a huge mutual aid response through all the other little cities. Makeup of that area, right? I mean, there's a lot of fire departments.
There's one picture that you have in the Firehouse magazine. It's also in the book.
Yeah.
Or I don't know if that one's in the book, but I have it on video.
Mm-hmm.
The chief is standing there by himself.
This one.
Yes. And there's flames coming out of a multi-story commercial structure.
Yeah.
And basically, you're shrugging your shoulders because he doesn't have any fire companies there. There's no water. There's no firefighters.
And wasn't that an issue in your book, too, with Sparks, that they were saying, where are the companies?
Yeah.
Nobody's coming.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean,
people approach them, and they, like Bemis heard lay people saying, where's the firefighters? That was June 11th, I think. That night where they're out setting 7 of the multiple on fires.
June 11th was pivotal
the biggest night. And companies came from Weymouth, Quincy, all outside companies were the first to arrive at a fire. Not a Boston company.
It's incredible.
The Chaplain.
Chaplain was the first one out of the fire that night.
And then your buddy from Ladder
29.
Ladder 29 was one of them, and just no water, buildings going stem to stern.
Yeah, Ladder 29 was an extra piece then. It was an old piece, and he responded to one of the first major multiple alarm fires of the night, and then the radio call come in for another one, and he's actually heading back to quarters, and he said, I'd like to respond, so they send him to that, and then he goes to another one, and it's an extra piece. Yeah. It's an older ladder truck,
It's an incredible, I really didn't know much about this story until the last few weeks when Rob brought this to my attention, and then I was talking with a few people that are familiar, and we have some friends on the job up in that area that are very familiar with the history of it. I think this story is incredible. We're excited to get this out. I'm so happy that you came in tonight to speak with us. I mean, it's a pivotal role in the American Fire Service, in fire investigation, in the longevity of the ATF. I mean, all of it is just...
There's history here. It's Boston history. Right. It's Boston area history, yes. It's fire history.
Right.
It's ATF history. It's an arson chronicle. I have 14 teaching points I do for certain... I'm doing a Maine IAAI in a couple of weeks.
Great.
And they wanted me to do 6 hours. And so I have 14 teaching points that take away from this case.
Yeah.
I do, speaking for the buffs, fire buffs. I've done it in this Friday. I'm doing it in New Haven with the Connecticut Fire Photographers.
Good group.
There's so much interest in this. It's been amazing, and I've gotten so much help from so many people.
It's great,
and I love doing the project. The publishing part was the biggest pain in the but
yeah, sure.
But I self-published. But
oh, really?
Yes.
Wow.
But everything's a learning process. Just like I have Facebook, Burn Boston Burn is the Facebook page, and I never did Facebook in my life.
Sure. And
just yesterday, I did the LinkedIn yesterday and a Twitter account a couple of days ago. But I don't know what to do with Twitter yet. Still, and so it's been fun. And my website, burnbostonburn.com.
Yeah, so I'm glad that we were gonna plug all that, of course, for you. But absolutely, I mean, there's a lot of information about this out there. But what you've done is, being that lead and being so heavily involved in this case and being the lead investigator and so on. I mean, this book is just bulletproof, man. I mean, there's so much stuff in it, and it's a history book. And if you're into the American Fire Service, into fire investigation, if you like crime novels, I mean, all of it. There's a lot of detail. And it's very well written, and I'm truly honored to have you here tonight, and we're looking forward to do some more projects with you, and to get the word out about Burn Boston Burn. It's one heck of a book, and I thank you for being here tonight. It's been a fantastic storytelling.
I loved it. I like talking about the case.
Yeah, of course.
I really appreciate you guys reaching out to me and having me.
We're great. Ecstatic to have you here. I mean, this has been awesome. So
and we should say that November 19th, because this will be out in the next few days, this podcast, but November 19th in Framingham, Massachusetts, we're going to be having one of our on tap episodes. We're going to be doing a Northeast Truck Company roundtable discussion, but before
turntable to the round table.
From the turntable to the round table, as Mr. Ridley likes to say. But the fun thing about that is this is your backyard, and so we're excited to have you there. And what we'll do is we'll have books there, and Wayne will certainly have a few minutes to chat about the history of Burn Boston Burn, the book that he had written, and we'll have some slides up and some video of actual fires and so on. We were talking about maybe getting that up too.
Yep.
And so on. So it's a fantastic opportunity. So if you're in that New England area, Framingham is between Worcester and Boston. I hope I said Worcester right.
That's close enough.
Close enough. New Jersey accent, right? But
at Jack's Abbey.
Jack's Abbey, right? Yeah. Jack's Abbey Brewing Company, and we're taking the place over. It's going to be a great night from 6 to 10, and so we entice you to come. It's going to be a great night of brotherhood and celebrating the fire service. And I think this falls right in line with it, Wayne. That you very much fit what we're trying to do for the fire service, and we love history and culture and tradition. And this is History 101. I mean, this is something that any spark fire buff or anybody that's just into the job, it's a fantastic read and full of information. So We'd love to get you out there, and I can't thank you enough for being here.
It's in my calendar already.
Awesome. I love it. Thank you so much, Wayne, truly.
Thank you, guys.
So, good. What do you got? You taking us out?
I'll take us out, man.
Take it out.
Everybody, it's Rob, National Fire Radio. Thanks for joining us tonight. Wayne Miller, Burn, Boston Burn, retired ATF, now featured author here on National Fire Radio.
Featured offer. Nice.
But thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys later. Don't forget our On Tap event out in Massachusetts on the 19th of November. We'll see you there. This is Rob, National Fire Radio, Jeremy, Tucker, and Wayne Miller.
Cheers, everybody.
Thank you,
Good night.
Wayne. Good night.